Hello everybody who's already on. We will be beginning shortly. While we wait, if someone in the comments would just let me know if you can hear my audio all right before I dive in. See, we've got people, someone from Denmark on so far. Hello from Germany. Thank you all for letting me know you can hear me. Got Ontario on. See, we've got some bird photographers jumping in. Wrangell, Alaska. Awesome. South Africa. Toronto, Italy. Wow, we've got a diverse audience here today. I'm looking forward to this. Still got a couple more minutes before we'll begin. If you haven't already, please let me know in the chat where you're tuning in from and what your favorite type of photography is. It doesn't have to be wildlife. Got somebody watching from Kuwait. We've got Scotland, more Germany, Sweden. We've got butterfly photographers. We've got bird photographers. Got quite a bit of macro, nature and astrophotography. I have a sore spot for astrophotography as well. Lots of nature photographers from all different walks of the genre. More folks from Germany hopping on. It's good to have you. Okay, we are about a minute past the top of the hour here, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to explain a little bit first about the format of what this talk's going to look like today. So I am obviously going to be presenting about wildlife photography. I will talk a little bit about the gear that I use. I'm going to guide you guys sort of a little bit through the behind the scenes of wildlife photography. So talking about how you'll set up a shoot, what sort of research and planning goes into a wildlife photography shoot. I'll talk about obviously when you're actually in the field photographing your wild subjects, what that could look like, what it should look like, give you my favorite tips and pointers, both for composing your shot and for settings. I'm going to talk a little bit about post-production. And then after I sort of get through all of that, I'm also going to talk quite a bit about gear. I've got something really exciting that I get to talk about today, which I'm looking forward to. After I get through those pointers, I'm going to pull up a series of images that are some of my favorites from the field and talk to you a little bit about how each image represents different elements from my talking points throughout my presentation. So as I'm doing my presentation, I will do my best to keep an eye on the chat here. I do want people to ask questions. However, we do have, at the end of the hour presentation, we've got a half hour following where I'll open it up and try to address and answer as many questions as I can get to. So if you do have something relevant while I'm teaching, go ahead and ask it in the chat. If I see it in time and haven't already moved on, I'll do my best to address it. Otherwise, go ahead and hold your questions until the end so that I can really focus and dive in. So without further ado, let me go ahead and pull up my presentation here. And we will go ahead and get started. All right. So who am I? Well, my name is Brooke Bartleson. I am an Olympus explorer, and I am a wildlife photographer almost exclusively. I do dabble a little bit in astrophotography and landscape. I started out as a landscape and lifestyle photographer. I also have done a little bit of sports, winter sports like snowboarding and skiing, just because I do live in a very wintry, mountainous environment. I'm currently based up in Salt Lake City, Utah. Moved out here in February of last year. Prior to that, I was living in Colorado, up in the mountains, in a town called Silverthorne. And most of my shots come from either Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, Alaska, and British Columbia, in that order. There are also some photos in this presentation, I believe, that were taken up in Manitoba, polar bears up on the Arctic tundra, just outside of Churchill in that area. So for the most part, I am shooting wildlife of North America. I'm definitely laser focused on that genre right now, just because it's definitely relevant to where I live. It's easy to access. And there are a lot of climate battles that need to be fought in our edge of the world that I'm enjoying using my photography as a method of being a spokesperson for. I do obviously have aspirations to eventually shoot in other countries, but as of right now, I am definitely hyper-focused on wildlife of North America. So I've been doing wildlife photography now for about 4 years. It was a slow transition from landscape and lifestyle over to wildlife at first, and then all of a sudden it became very abrupt. When I was doing lifestyle photography, I was doing a lot of product shoots for various different sorts of outdoor brands. There were ranchwear companies that I worked with, coffee companies, camouflage, hunting gear companies. When I was heading out on these shoots to go photograph the gear, I was seeing a lot of animals along the way because I was driving up into mountainous, remote areas looking for the best, view and backdrop for my photos to be composed in front of. And I started aiming my camera more towards the animals in the area and less toward the landscape and the products I was supposed to be shooting. After kind of dabbling in both genres for maybe about a little over a year, I completely gave up on any other form of photography and really just followed my passion, which is wildlife. About 1 year into my wildlife photography journey, I started shooting with Olympus gear. I'm definitely going to go quite a bit more into depth later on in this presentation about why specifically Olympus, but it has been just over 2 years that I've been shooting with them now, and it's been an incredible, awesome few years of lots of technological developments and travel, and I'm excited to tell you all more about that. If you do want to see more of my work, feel free to check out my social media. My Instagram name is Brooke Little Bear. That's very easy to remember. Brooke, like a little bear, which are my favorite subjects. I kind of touched on this already a little bit, but why wildlife specifically, and almost so exclusively? There's many different reasons why, but I would say the main two are, number one, I've just always been absolutely obsessed with animals. I've had a natural inclination towards anything having to do with animals. I've always had a million pets, stuffed animals, picture books about animals when I was a little kid. As I got older, that obsession turned into a passion, and I realized that there are a lot of areas and populations of wildlife right now that are threatened by human development. And through photography, I can make people really, really care about these animals that I love so much. So that way people who maybe live, let's say in New Jersey, on the east coast of the United States where I grew up, who might not have access to large populations of charismatic wildlife, might still feel a connection through my photography to these animals and be more interested to get involved in whatever sort of conservation is needed for that specific species or their habitat. Now I'm going to go ahead and make some assumptions about who you all are. So clearly we've got a group of people calling in today from all over the world. Truly the four current corners. We've got Europe, we've got South Africa, we've got Canada, we've got the United States. because they're such a diverse group, amongst everybody here watching, we probably have access to almost every type of wildlife species in the world, from folks who might be limited to just backyard, more urban wildlife, right? Like birds, squirrels, raccoons, foxes, maybe the occasional black bear, to people who are in areas with large charismatic megafauna, like the animals that I'll be showing in this presentation. And I'm going to assume that you probably photograph, as of this year at least, pretty close to home, because COVID has put quite a lot of travel restrictions in place. So I'm assuming most people aren't getting to go out on these continents banning wildlife photography dream trips like we would probably rather be doing. And instead you're exploring whatever you have available to you. Now I'm also going to assume, because you're dialing into a presentation like this on a busy weekday when you've probably got other things going on, you're probably pretty passionate about photography as a whole. You are probably already a wildlife photographer, or you are aspiring to be one, and that's probably because somewhere in your heart you have love for the genre that is wildlife photography, and through that you have love for your subjects. This is a question that I like to ask of all of my viewers when I start presentations like this. I want you to really think about the answer to this question. How much do you love your wild subjects? I encourage you to love them a lot. The more you love them, the more you care about them, the more passionate you are about them. Naturally, the more subconsciously you'll be inclined to capture them and present them in the best possible way. So now let's talk about those subjects. Who are they? Well, they don't necessarily have to be something as exotic as a polar bear on the tundras of Manitoba's Hudson Bay. They can be anything, like I said earlier: squirrels, birds in your backyard, deer in the rural farmland not far from your city, maybe elk in the woods on a preserve not far from where you live. Chances are, because they are wild, they are also free, unpredictable, and delicate. What that means is that their behavior and where they're going to be at any given time is never a guarantee. It's never going to be super easy to predict. And there's always going to be the need to show as much respect as possible for the delicate wildlife that you're photographing, as well as the delicate ecosystem that you're going to be accessing when you head out to go shoot. Whether that's something as simple as your backyard ecosystem, flock of migratory birds maybe has taken up residence near your feeder for the season. In the winter time, they're looking for easy food sources right now. Or if that's something as exotic as polar bears on the protected tundra land, or say you are out on a wildlife safari somewhere on also a wildlife preserve. You do need to go afield with the mindset that your subjects are wild, free, unpredictable, and delicate, and act accordingly. So we're going to talk gear a little bit more in this presentation than I typically do, just because I have something really exciting to talk about that I actually haven't been allowed to talk about up until yesterday or 2 days ago, which I'll get into in just a second. But gear that you are absolutely going to need when you go out to photograph wildlife includes a telephoto lens. I suggest a focal length of no less than 100 millimeters, preferably something that goes up to 300 millimeters or more. That'll give you the best field of view so that you're not getting frustrated with wildlife being too distant. It'll help you keep a safe distance from your subjects so that they can live wildly and you don't have to worry. And it'll still enable you to get some pretty intimate looks at the animals that you're photographing. I also say that a durable camera body is absolutely essential because wild animals tend to live in unpredictable environments, such as the wilderness. You want camera that can handle whatever conditions you might be shooting in, whether that's cold weather, wet weather, super hot weather. Whatever the animals have to endure, so will you and your camera. So make sure you've got a setup that can handle those conditions so you're not having to leave early or disappointed because the weather wasn't bright and sunny and mild temps. A tripod for some camera setups will be ideal depending on what you're shooting with. Personally, I don't carry a tripod with me. There's no need with the gear that I shoot with. In the photo here of me in front of my traveling hotel room, which is my car, I am holding my new favorite lens in the world, which I'll get to in just a moment. So like I mentioned, I shoot Olympus cameras. There's a very good reason why I shoot Olympus cameras. Actually, there are millions of reasons. I had to limit myself to only the ones bulleted here. lest I talk for all eternity and sound more like an infomercial than an actual presentation about how to photograph wildlife. So right here, what we've got pictured is what my go-to setup was up until this fall. I shot with these two camera bodies I typically had in my bag. I like the one on the left, the OMD EM1 Mark III, when I don't really need something super ultra mega lightweight. If I am looking for something really lightweight, I'll shoot with that camera on the right there. Then I've got those two telephoto lenses and then the teleconverters if I need a little bit of extra reach. This was my primary setup, is still the bulk of my primary setup, mainly because of these points. First one being, this gear, everything you see pictured here, is completely weatherproof. That means I can go out and shoot in the pouring rain. I can go out and shoot in an extremely dusty area, say I'm shooting wild horses or something like that that lives in a more desert climate where there's a lot of dust particles in the air. I can shoot in driving snow, ice storms, extreme cold, wind, any adverse weather conditions you might encounter in the field. My gear has lived through it and has come out to tell the story on the other side. So that has made this Olympus gear something that's definitely specifically perfect for me and what I do. Also, all of this gear is extremely lightweight. It's all really compact. These cameras and lenses operate on a micro 4/3 system. So what that means is where you're seeing a 300 millimeter telephoto lens, it's actually giving me a 600 millimeter field of view, which is an insane amount of focal length, at the compact size and weight of a 300 millimeter lens. Enables me to hike further, walk longer, not have to stress about the weight of my pack or forego things like water and other essentials when I'm hiking long distances for wildlife. This gear is all super durable. Like I said, that goes hand in hand with being weatherproof. This gear has also taken a little bit of a beating. When I'm out hiking, I typically have my camera slung around my shoulder, just in case an animal pops out when I'm least expecting it. I'm able to swing my camera up and start photographing really easily. That obviously means my camera is often exposed to the terrain that I am traversing, which means my cameras get banged up like you wouldn't believe. And aside from some cosmetic damage, like scratches and things like that, it has never affected my gear's performance. So that's definitely a huge point that's important to me. Now, Olympus also has some specific settings that is fantastic for wildlife photography. My favorite one is called Pro Capture Mode. I am not the most techie person, so forgive me if my explanation leaves you asking questions as to how exactly this even works. To me, it's just absolute magic. I couldn't even begin to explain how Olympus created a mode like this, but basically, what Pro Capture Mode does is when I am shooting an animal and I'm waiting for it to do a specific behavior, whether that's a bird taking flight, or a grazing deer lifts its head and finally makes eye contact, or a bear catches a salmon as it's leaping up a waterfall. Instead of shooting in continuous shutter mode, which is usually the preferred shooting mode, right, for most wildlife photo shoots, the downside of shooting in continuous shutter is if you're anticipating a movement from an animal and you hit that shutter and you take a whole burst of however many photos and the animal doesn't do the behavior you were looking for, you now have, like, let's say 10 to 50 even frames of an animal doing a whole lot of nothing that's now clogging up your memory card. You're in the field, you probably don't have time to go back and clear that card and free up that space. Pro Capture Mode solves that issue by essentially, when you have Pro Capture Mode on and you're waiting for an animal to do that behavior, you press your shutter button down halfway. The camera is recording a burst of images just like it would be in continuous shooting mode. However, it's not yet writing them to your memory card. So it's recording, deleting, because you're not yet telling the camera to save those photos. When the animal does the thing you've been waiting for, like makes eye contact or catches a fish or takes flight, you push the shutter button all the way down. And now all of the images a few seconds before you actually pressed the button and a few seconds after are all captured. So even if that split second you're waiting for a bird to take flight, you kind of miss it by like a heartbeat. By the time you've pressed the shutter, the bird's already gone. You don't have to worry. Those few seconds leading up to that action are already recorded on your memory card. Again, from a technological standpoint, I have no idea how this works. I do know as of right now, it's something that's exclusive to Olympus cameras, and I live in Pro Capture Mode. It is absolutely essential to me at this point. I can't shoot without it. It's just such a nice luxury to have. Another great luxury of Olympus cameras is they have the best image stabilization in the world between their telephoto lenses and their camera bodies. I don't carry a tripod with me at all. I haven't since I switched over to Olympus. There's absolutely no need. The image stabilization acts just as well as any tripod could. I get to have the luxury of not needing to carry all that weight with me when I'm hiking, backpacking, running, whatever it is that's taking me to where the animals are. And then, of course, the images still come out tack sharp. Olympus has such good glass and technology within the camera bodies and lenses themselves that the sharpness of an image, no matter what focal length I'm shooting at, has never been an issue for me, thanks to all of those features, including the image stabilization. Now, I mentioned when I started talking about my gear that up until recently, the gear pictured here was my primary gear. Well, earlier this week, Olympus launched a new massive telephoto lens, the likes of which really hasn't been seen before. Introducing the brand new OMSYSTEM 150 to 400 millimeter f4.5 TCI 1.25x IS Pro. That is a mouthful of a name. This is a incredible lens. It lives up to the long name. Some of the features, and I'm not going to dive too deep into this lens because I could talk about it forever, and I want to actually teach you guys a little bit about wildlife photography and not just about amazing lenses. But essentially, it was designed with birders and wildlife photographers in mind. So it offers an insane amount of focal length, 375 to 100 millimeter equivalent focal range with just this lens itself. It has a built-in teleconverter. It's just a little switch on the other side from what you see pictured here that you flick on over, and it increases your focal length up beyond that 800 millimeter field of view equivalent to 1000 millimeters, which for me, what I shoot, being megafauna, large animals, is typically more focal length than I ever need. So it's really good insurance policy for me that it even reaches this far. It's got 8-axis image stabilization, which is insane. When I tested this lens, I fully expected to need a tripod. And the image stabilization is so fantastic that even with that teleconverter switched on, I did not have a need to shoot with a tripod once over the week or so that I was testing this lens. It's got a bunch of customizable function switches that help you change the settings really quickly and easily when you're in the field, so you're not having to scroll through a million menus or really use all that much brain power so you can stay focused on what you're shooting. It's got a heat-resistant exterior coating, a hydrophobic lens coating, which means water droplets on rainy and snowy days don't make splotches or any smudges on the actual glass of the lens. It's hydrophobic, so that water disperses. The attention to detail in that is just insane to me, and it actually made a huge difference when I was testing and shooting that day. It's compatible with those 2 teleconverters that I had pictured on the slide prior, so it extends the reach even further. And then there's a super lightweight carbon fiber lens hood that actually is like 1/3 of the actual length of the lens. So with the lens hood pulled out, the lens looks a lot longer than it actually is. It's really compact, really lightweight. So these are the zoom ranges. You can see 300 to 800 millimeter is the standard zoom range of the lens. You flick that teleconverter switch, and now you have 375 to 1000 millimeter field of view. And then if you add on all of these different combinations of the teleconverters that you see here, you can extend that field of view that much further. So that allows you to get a maximum focal reach of 2000 millimeters, which is just insane amount of focal length. So back to actually going out to shoot wildlife. There are a few things that you need to do before you even leave your house, head out onto the field and start photographing the animals. Step 1 is do your research. That includes researching where you're going to go shoot, what the weather is going to look like where you're shooting, what sort of wildlife lives where you're going to shoot, aside from just the animal that you have as your sort of target, and any other relevant information about the area, whether how long it is from where you're either staying or where you live, what the terrain looks like, if there are any active safety hazards in the area, like forest fires are very relevant right now, I know in the western parts of the United States and Canada. Things like snowstorms, now that we're moving into the winter months. Is there dangerous weather conditions that will be rolling in either while you're shooting or while you're commuting home? Based accordingly on what your research tells you, prep up your pack. That doesn't just mean your camera gear. That also means whatever extra layers or water or snacks or safety gear you might need to carry with you. And then prep yourself mentally and physically. I mean, go ahead, get dressed. Make sure you're prepared to go be in the woods. But also mentally level your expectations. Know that when you go into the field, there is no guarantee of ever finding wildlife, or specifically finding the wildlife that you're heading out to go shoot. Keep that mindset, your expectations level, so you don't get frustrated, and so that you be maybe a little bit more opportunistic when animals do reveal themselves, which I'll go a little bit more into here soon. So, people ask me all the time, Brooke, how do you find your wild subjects? I wish I had a really easy answer for this. I wish I have found one method that's like a guarantee to where I'm going to find animals when. The reality is it's a lot of work. There are a few different methods that I suggest to maximize your potential of finding animals. First one being, which is like, honestly, I think a little bit counterintuitive in this day and age, is crowdsourcing. So I use social media, Instagram, Facebook, and neighborhood apps on your cell phone, like the Nextdoor app that we have here in the US, to get an idea of where the public has seen animals recently. I noticed that if you go on Instagram and search a geotag, something like a wildlife preserve near you, or a hiking trail near you, or a national forest not far from where you live or where you're vacationing, and you review all of the people who visited that area's recent photos, who've geotagged themselves there, you'll start to see a trend if there are animals frequently in that area. So if it's an area that has a lot of deer, you'll scroll through people's recent photos, see a whole lot of people posting photos of deer in that area, or elk or moose, things like that. Now, I also use Facebook and the Nextdoor app because I have found that community pages, so any page on social media where neighbors use that form of social media to communicate amongst one another, usually these pages and these apps are intended to be used for things like, hey, we have a power outage on those cross streets of Euclid and Maine. Just a heads up, it might be a while before our power comes back on. Or, hey, has anybody seen my missing cat or my lost dog? Or, hey, just a heads up, somebody's been stealing packages off my porch. Neighbors, look out for yourselves. I also noticed that people in neighborhoods get really proud when they have interesting or charismatic wildlife passing through the area. And they love to post on these apps and Facebook pages like, hey, check out this fox in my backyard. Or, hey, look, there was a moose walking down my driveway. How cool is that? I've now started, when I go travel to a new area, an area that I haven't visited before, if I suspect there might be wildlife around, I will request to join different neighborhood pages so that I can try to get an idea if there are wild animals crossing through different areas in certain parts of cities or rural communities, depending on where I am. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but it's really, really nice. Then there's also tracking. I think when I say wildlife tracking, people picture like some burly mountain man who's like got all of this crazy wildlife knowledge. The reality is tracking wildlife isn't as difficult as you might think right off the bat, especially this time of year. Most parts of the world have snow cover on the ground. If you're lucky enough to live in an area where there is snow this time of year, makes wildlife tracking easy as pie because obviously snow holds animal tracks really, really well. And even if there isn't snow on the ground and it's high summer, the dry season, there are all sorts of little things on the environment that indicate whether an animal has passed through recently. They can be as glaringly obvious as piles of animal poop, actual physical animal footprints, and they can be as subtle as just things on the environment like game trails, or spotting prey animals and knowing that those indicate most likely their predator is around. I highly encourage, if you're going to get really into wildlife photography, do some research on tracking and practice it in the field as much as you can to really dial in and strengthen those muscles. Next up is obviously knowing when to go. Now, I'll get texts from friends and other photographers at like the middle of the day at noon, and they say, I've been driving around for hours in this area where you told me there are tons of foxes and I haven't seen a thing. And I'm like, well, yeah, of course not. The middle of the day, for almost every species of animal that I photograph at least, animals aren't as active. They're either feeding or they're bedded down to avoid the peak sunlight hours when predators are more likely to be able to find them, or when the weather's a little bit warmer. For the most part, mornings and evenings, usually right around sunrise and sunset, are the absolute best times to go out into the field to photograph wildlife. What's really nice for us wildlife photographers is those are obviously also the golden hours, the hours where the natural light is the best. So it makes your life a lot easier to know when the light is the most harsh. You really probably won't have much luck finding animals anyway. And then last but not least, remember when you go to find your subjects that nothing that's wild is mundane. I have this photo here of a raven. The story behind this is I was actually up watching a pack of wolves that day, and I was really hoping to get some photos of the wolves close up. I watched them hunt an elk, take the elk down, start eating the elk carcass, all through my spotting scope when they were about a mile across the valley, which was entirely too far to get a well-composed image of these wolves. I was really bummed. I was waiting for hours and hours and hours for them to move a little bit closer within range of where I was. Obviously, they were hunting, so it wasn't smart or safe, or I think even legal for me to approach where they were. Finally, I started to realize there's not a chance that these wolves are going to come any closer. But I did notice there were all these really smart birds hanging around. Ravens, vultures, eagles, and other scavengers. They were lingering kind of close to the road where I was. Every now and then when the wolves would back off from the carcass, they would fly out to scavenge pieces of meat. And then they'd fly out back towards the road to wait for their opportunity to move in again. So I started laying on my stomach and photographing all these birds at close range. And while this shot obviously isn't of a wild wolf, I still thought it was a pretty cool, nice, detailed shot of a raven, which is something I might never have pointed my camera lens at otherwise if I hadn't kept that mindset of like, nothing is mundane. Just because it's not the animal you were looking for doesn't mean it won't still make a great shot. So this is something that I won't spend too much time talking about because we do have a lot that I want to go over today, but I always add it into my wildlife photography presentations because to me, this is like the most important thing ever. So keeping the wild should always be your primary goal as a wildlife photographer. And I mean, before your goal is even like to get a great photo, your goal should be to make sure you're not disturbing your delicate wild subjects. Just some general rules of thumb. Never approach your subjects. Not only could that put you at extreme risk of getting eaten or trampled or kicked in the face or something, it also stresses out the wildlife that you're shooting. A direct approach by a human toward any animal is going to change their behavior, start making them a little bit more alert and more nervous. If they don't leave the area entirely and you still get to photograph them, they're going to look stressed out on camera. Any experienced wildlife photographer is going to be able to tell a stressed out animal from a relaxed animal. And I'll just tell you, I've never seen a good photo of a terrified animal. Do not feed the wildlife. I know more than anybody how tempting it can be if you see like a bunch of little foxes to just wish you could throw a hot dog their way and entice them to come closer to you. Reality is a fed fox is a dead fox. And that goes for any type of animal. Wildlife can easily become dependent and habituated to human-provided food sources, which never ends well for the animal. Either they get used to coming too close to humans, and then they get hit by cars or eliminated because people mistake their behavior as aggressive, or the human who is feeding them has something else going on in their life, and they stop providing food to the animal, and the animal that's gotten used to not having to hunt begins to starve or get sick. So with that, be patient. Try to anticipate where the animals are moving toward. Position yourself in that area. Don't be so quiet, depending on what you're shooting, that they don't know you're there. Keep your distance and be patient and allow for them to relax and start moving closer to where you are. Start moving within range so you can get those intimate photos. I also I have a cool tip that I learned from somebody recently, another Olympus shooter, actually, his name is Ben. He said, you know it's a good wildlife shoot when you leave before your subject does. I think that's such a good way to really put this. When you leave, you get the shots that you came for, and the animal is so relaxed in your presence that it didn't bolt or run off. That's how you know you've done your job. You let the wild be wild. You still came away with great photos. You knew when to head home. You left before the animal was disturbed. Okay, so choosing your settings, I am going to talk about settings. I do want to say that when it comes to my own style of photography and my own ideas behind photography as an art, I am not a very technical or settings mindset person. People ask me all the time what their default settings should be for wildlife photography. My answer to that is I have no clue. There are no default settings. There are some settings that maybe I would recommend starting in, but I highly encourage you to constantly change and play with your settings. There's almost nothing in wildlife photography specifically that we, the photographer, can control. So it's really important to capitalize on whatever you can control. You have control of your settings, so play around as much as you can. Take advantage of the one thing you have control over. So I recommend using continuous shutter mode or pro capture mode if you have it. That enables you to capture the whole animal's action. So whether they're moving or lifting their head or changing their stance, you're capturing kind of the whole progression there. Personally, I have found that animals move too quickly on their environment and the conditions change too fast for me to really feel ever comfortable shooting in manual. I do shoot in manual if an animal is relatively stationary. They're not moving between shadows and sunlit patches really quickly. But to just make my mindset or my life a little bit easier, I shoot primarily in aperture priority mode. Depth of field is very important to my style. I really like strong isolation between the subject and the backdrop. Aperture value lets me have a lot of control over that, and I can adjust it accordingly. If it's an animal like this little fox here that was moving somewhat quickly across the environment, I'll switch over to shutter priority mode so I can control that. But for the most part, personally, I live in aperture value. Whatever settings you think work best for you, though, I highly encourage you, you kind of do your own thing and don't just go on what anyone says. And obviously, like I said, change your settings constantly. I like to use this photo here as an example of that. As you can see, half of this fox is in pretty intense shadow, and the other half is in direct sunlight. This fox wasn't moving super quick, but he was hunting. So he was moving between shadows cast by trees, back into blinding light, back into shadows cast by trees. And I was adjusting my settings basically with every step he took. Keep that in mind when you go out to shoot. Don't let your settings limit yourself. Everything else is up against you in wildlife photography. Don't make it harder by putting yourself in a box when it comes to settings. So what I think is more important even than settings by a long shot is the actual composition of your photos. Now, I know better than anybody that when you've been searching forever and ever for a wild animal to photograph, you can get so excited when you finally find them that you point your camera at them, take a million shots. That's great. You have your photo proof that you finally found your animal. Try to rein in that excitement a little bit, slow down, and really think about how you can maximize this brief encounter to get the best possible photo. If you can, safely, move around a little bit maybe. Slowly move with or away from where the animal's moving to frame them better on the environment. Get eye level if you're able, again, to move without disturbing the animal. I like to use this photo here of this bear. Being eye level with a grizzly bear is not something you will typically do in real life unless or something you'll see typically with the naked eye is what I'm trying to say, unless you're in extreme peril. When you have the luxury of having a telephoto lens, obviously you can stand a really far distance back, still be safe, and get eye level with your subject to provide that more intimate angle that people might not ever really have the opportunity to see with their naked eye. Hopefully, if it's a grizzly bear. Think a lot about your framing. I am the queen of getting so excited about an animal that I take a million photos and then realize I cropped out their antlers or their feet or a big bushy tail if the tail is like the tail of a fox, something that's very charismatic on the animal itself. So think about how you want to frame your shot. Make sure you're not cutting out any key components of the animal or their environment. Back up a little bit if you need to offer more open space around the animal so that you're not cutting them out in the frame. And then be opportunistic. Again, there's not much that you can control in wildlife photography. Whatever opportunity the composition presents itself with, use it to your best ability. So in a situation like this bear was moving up against tree line. So as you can kind of see on the right-hand side, right before, or in the middle of the image really, there's those darker patches. To the right of the bear, or I'm sorry, to the right of that darker patch were more trees of that dark color. So when I had my camera angled a little bit more head on from the bear, she wasn't really standing out very much against the dark wooded backdrop. When I angled my camera a little bit more from this perspective, I now had the white snowy backdrop behind her, and it gave me the opportunity to provide a little bit more contrast between the animal and the subject. So whatever opportunities you can take when you're out shooting, keep those in mind, take them to compose your shot. As a note about post-processing, I like to bring this up a lot in wildlife photography because I think it's something that's somehow really controversial. I'm not really sure why. I think post-processing can be very helpful in your process. It can be another outlet for creativity, which is amazing. As artists, we're always looking for ways to express ourselves creatively. It can also help bring out the mood or the intensity. When I took this photo, the sky was very washed out, so I was able to lower those highlights when I was editing. So now you could see the storm that was moving in, the cold front blowing in while I was photographing this elk. And I get asked a lot if cropping is considered cheating in wildlife photography. The answer to that is absolutely not. Cropping is key. Cropping is my best friend. If an animal is filling your frame without you cropping it, there's a really good chance that you were too close to that animal. So don't be afraid to crop in. The only limit is what you make it. If you're somebody who prefers not to edit, don't feel pressured to. If you're somebody who wants to explore more of that creative outlet, by all means, go for it. Wildlife photography is a genre that definitely takes well to some thoughtful post-processing. So this is a photo that I like to use as an example of editing. So this fox was wicked smart. I was actually photographing a different female fox and her fox kits playing outside of their den in a neighborhood in Colorado. This fox saw that I was distracted, and when I had my attention on the fox den, he snuck into my car because I'd left my window open in my haste to hop out and start photographing. And he rummaged through my car with another fox, actually came in there with him, peed everywhere, scratched up my seats in my center console, and then by the time I turned around, they were already escaping. And I took this like split second of a moment before he jumped off the car photo just to prove what had happened. Now I realized when I got home, yeah, this is a funny photo, but there's also some pretty good detail in the fox himself. I really liked his face. I liked kind of the softer lighting. I wanted to make this salvageable and see if I could present this fox in a way that you would never guess that he was standing on my car when I photographed him. So I cropped in really tightly. I muted the tones in the background. I desaturated those reds, made some of the highlights on his fur stand out. And by looking at this image, you would never know that this was actually a fox standing on my car in a neighborhood. Instead, it almost looks like a photo taken of a captive fox in a studio or something like that. So this is a more extreme example of what you can do with editing. It's fun to try. I invite everybody to push their limits a little bit just to see, you know, how far you can go. It's fun. It's a cool expression. It can be its own form of art. Now, this is going to be a little bit, a lot of a less heavy-handed example of the type of editing I'll do. So this was a cool owl opportunity. The owl was on a low-hanging branch up in British Columbia. This is a barred owl. And I held my camera up over my head so that I could get eye level with this owl. I swiveled my back screen down so I could still keep an eye on what it was doing. And I love this photo. I think it was great out of camera. There were a few things about it that I found a little bit distracting. So when I edited, I removed some of those balls of light on the left-hand side of the owl, just kind of to get rid of the more distracting parts of that side of the image. And I changed the green from that sort of like vomity colored green to something a little bit more subtle, and changed my tones to kind of a cooler color palette all across the board. So not very heavy-handed compared to that first edit, but I just liked the way that these subtle changes really isolated the subject against its environment and added a sense of like mystery, which is how I felt in the moment. So now I'm going to move into some more photos that I'm not going to show the before and afters on of the edits because they're not super relevant, but I want to show this photo. This was one of the first images that I took with that new 150 to 400 millimeter lens. I am so excited about this photo because this was a black bear cub, which is not a subject that I would be photographing from close range probably ever, unless I was safe inside my car. Obviously, when you're photographing a cub, its mama's around, there's a high level of potential danger. I was able to stand so far away from this little bear cub with that 150 to 400 millimeter lens that at no point did I ever feel stressed, and at no point was the bear ever stressed. He was able to graze on the berries in this bush. I watched him for almost an hour as he ate, and at no time did he ever seem stressed out or bothered by my presence, and I never had a scary interaction with the mom. So this is just an image that I kind of want to use to nail home the point of the longer your focal length is, the more safe you're going to be, the more natural your subject's going to be able to act, and the more intimate the photos you can get of that animal are. I also want to make a note that right before the 150 to 400 millimeter lens came out, Olympus also came out with a 100 to 400 millimeter lens. It's not of the same caliber of engineering as the larger lens. It is a little bit more of an affordable price point. I did get to test that lens and I absolutely loved it. I don't have any photo examples in this presentation though of me using it. I saw that a few people have asked about that in the chat, so I did just want to address it. I also want to point out too, with this photo, my ISO here was pretty high. It was 2000. It's higher than I would usually choose to shoot in. As you can see, if you really pixel peep, there's a little bit of grain on the smoother parts of the photo. Again, don't be boxed in by what settings you're comfortable with. Don't be afraid to push the limits if that's what it takes to get the better shot. I cranked my ISO higher than I normally would, and I'm quite pleased with the results here. So this mountain goat photo is an example of being opportunistic. I was up on the shores of Seward, Alaska. I was just on my friend's boat. We were out having kind of a leisurely, scenic sail of the bay. And I saw this mountain goat making its way up these black cliffs. And this was my first time seeing a mountain goat in Alaska, so I was absolutely floored. I was yelling, "Captain Nick, like, bring us in close. Full sail ahead, like, let's go get near that mountain goat." And he was like, "Brooke, you're crazy. We're gonna crash the boat if we try to get any closer to those cliffs. Like, get your photo or don't, I don't care, figure it out." You've probably noticed the trend with a lot of my photos is that I like close, intimate photographs of my wild subjects. Obviously, that wasn't gonna happen in this situation. We were still really far out from this mountain goat. So I took the opportunity to think about how I could frame this as best as I could to still get a interesting and somewhat compelling photo. Luckily, the contrast of that mountain goat up against the black rocks kind of did the work for me, and I took the opportunity to take a slightly different style of photo than I normally would, which I think ended up being a pretty cool environmental shot. This is an example, again, of getting eye level with your subject. I was laying on my stomach as this bear was making her way through the grass. She was foraging grass after coming out of hibernation only a few days prior to this. The other photographers that I was with that day were all photographing her from a standing angle, but because she was kind of on a hill from where we were standing, and she was kind of a smaller bear, that angle of standing up just really wasn't compelling or intimate to me. So I laid down on my stomach as she slowly moved closer toward us and got this intimate, low-level eye contact shot here, which again is just something that's a little bit different than what we typically see with our naked eye. And I think it made the image just a little bit more interesting. This photo is one that I love to use as an example of moving around if you are able. So this is the final image of the moose on this day. I actually photographed this moose right outside of my friend's house when I was on my way over for dinner. This was the moose when I first pulled up onto my friend's street. He was standing right there, right off the side of the road. It was the evening, the sun was setting behind me, and it was just glaring on this moose, giving such a hard glare that I could barely even figure out how to dial in my focus because the moose was in just such intense shadow that the camera barely even noticed any detail in it. Obviously, the backdrop isn't great. I mean, it was just all of this sagebrush that was really harshly lit and all of these man-made structures. You can see part of the road on the right. You can see some signs and gate elements there on top of that hill. This was me being just so excited that there was a moose that I pulled out my camera and without any thought beforehand, just started firing off a bunch of shots. Then I slowed down and I realized that this road I could drive up a little ways, park my car, and then hike out behind where this moose is standing, shoot into the sun, and now get a really cool backlit moose with a much more desirable backdrop, because now the forest is behind the moose. All of these mosquitoes and dust particles in the air from my car driving down that dirt road caught the light and gave this really kind of like unique backlit, hazy, mystical look. So these photos were taken minutes apart and were so different just because I slowed down, took the time to think about how best to compose the photo. This is another example of being opportunistic. So this fox was hanging out on my neighbor's driveway, which is this really steep, sloping blacktop driveway. It was the end of the day, so the sun was kind of like shining on the side of this fox here. But when I first showed up and drove past my neighbor's house and saw the fox, I almost kept driving because I didn't want a photo of a fox with a human, an urban backdrop. I like my photos to look a little bit more wild and mysterious than that. So I almost passed up this opportunity, but then I realized, like, okay, I haven't seen a fox in quite some time. I'm going to stop and take some photos and just see what I can do here. So I took a round of shots of the fox. The blacktop was actually a pretty nice, smooth black backdrop. In post-production, I did smooth it and darken it just a little bit more. So now you have this crazy contrast between the driveway and the fox. And it again gives that effect of a captive fox being photographed in a studio, is what people ask me all the time. When in reality, this was a fox just sitting on my neighbor's driveway, and I didn't want to pass up an opportunity to take a picture. So I decided to push the limits and see what I could do to make this encounter salvageable. I also really like photos where there's a fox against sort of a smoother backdrop, just because foxes have so much detail in their fur and their faces. It's so cool, and it provides a really good contrast, good subject isolation. So this is another photo that I took with that new lens, the 150 to 400 millimeter. I'd never photographed a great gray owl before, so this was just really cool and special moment for me. I like to use this also as an example of getting eye level with your subject. Obviously, most birds perch pretty high up from you, so I did have to hold my camera up in the air above my face yet again to get this more eye level, intimate perspective here. I still am angled a little bit lower than the owl, or than like actual eye level with the owl, because I'm not a million feet tall and couldn't get directly on with it. I also like to include this image too, because as you can see looking at the branch, there's quite a bit of snow and ice accumulated there. We hiked for about 5 hours before we found this owl, and then we photographed him for maybe an hour and 45 minutes before we headed out that day. And over the course of that collective just under 7 hours that we were out in the field, it rained, snowed, hailed, and then rained, snowed, and hailed again. The weather changed constantly, which provided a really cool sort of dramatic contrast, showing the environment that the owl lived in. But if I hadn't had weatherproof gear, there is no way I could have stayed out that long and gotten any of these photos. So just kind of a visual way to show you all how important it is to have gear that can withstand the elements. That way you can really maximize your time. This elk photo here is one that I like to use also as an example of getting eye level. I was crouched down behind a bush here. I used part of the bush to frame that lower right-hand corner where the elk is walking. And I just think it's a little bit of a unique elk photo because I'm actually lower than eye level from him. So it's just a different perspective than what you might see if you were standing straight up. I use this photo as an example of being patient. This was taken in Yellowstone National Park, which is an incredible park for wildlife photography. There are abundant different populations of wildlife all over the place. There are also abundant populations of human tourists within the national park. On this day, part of the road ran right from the angle where I was looking at this bison from. It was a little bit further away from where the bison were originally when I first came upon them. If I made a right-hand turn a few meters up, there was a parking lot that was directly to the left of this bison here. And it was a lot closer to the bison than where the road right up ahead of him was. I saw all of these tourists standing in that parking lot using their cell phones and their iPads to get these sort of like broadside photos of the side of the bison, which I could have gone and joined them and shot from that angle. I just didn't think that was a very interesting angle to photograph a bison. So instead I sort of took my chances. And I just stood and waited on the side of the road right up ahead of the bison. At the time when I first started to wait, they were still pretty far out, closer to tree line, where those trees are in the background there. And it took quite a bit of patience before they started moving toward me. When the moment finally happened and they finally moved within range, I thought I got much more of an interesting photo of them head on walking toward me, eye level, than I would have if I had been impatient, pulled into that parking lot, and photographed just the sides of these bison. So again, slow down, really think about where you can position yourself to maximize your encounter and photograph the animal in the best perspective possible. This is another example of getting eye level with your subject. Again, another grizzly bear taken from a really low angle. This is also an example of the extreme weather conditions you might find yourself shooting in. Animals, specifically larger animals, like bears, bison, moose, and elk, they prefer to be more active when it's colder out. The hot sunlight really takes a toll on animals with more body mass and fur that are sort of designed for colder climates. When it's really snowy or really rainy, those are my favorite days to go out and shoot, because those are the days that I know large animals are most likely going to be out on the move. So again, having gear that I know can keep up with me and that I can trust isn't going to fail in the middle of a snowstorm is absolutely essential, because it enables me to get photos like this. Also, as a fun fact, a lot of people see this photo and ask, why wasn't this bear hibernating? This was actually taken in June. This was taken in the summer. This bear had already been out of hibernation for a few months. A completely random freak of nature snowstorm blew in. One day it dumped maybe 6 inches of snow, and by the next day it was warm and sunny again and all the snow melted. And that's why the bear has this sort of green foam around her mouth, because she had just been eating grass. So before we move into the Q&A section of my presentation, I do love to pull up this quote. It really kind of embodies what I'm trying to do here with wildlife photography. It's a Steve Irwin quote, the crocodile guy. If we can teach people about wildlife, they will be touched. Share my wildlife with me, because people want to save what they love. Wildlife photography is such an awesome way to bring animals into the homes of people who might not get to see them in their native habitat. It helps create a bond between the animal and the viewer, and can inspire people to care, people who might not have cared about these animals if they'd never connected via photography. The more people that care about a certain population of animals, the more people you can call upon when it comes time to make sort of pushes toward conservation of the animal or their habitat, which is very relevant in this day and age. So I'm going to start scrolling through the chat to see if there were any big questions that I missed. I'm also going to show my face now here. Hi, everybody. If you have questions that you didn't ask, please go ahead and drop them in the chat now. I'd love to address as many as I can in this last half hour here. All right. So I see a question here. How is the autofocus speed on the new lens compared with the other pro telephoto lenses? That's a really great question. Olympus has really good autofocus speed, and that new lens, the 150 to 400, is actually the fastest autofocus speed I've tested yet in an Olympus lens. It's whip sharp. I actually didn't realize that they had enhanced that technology in the release of this lens. So I was just mesmerized. I thought like I was doing something better in my photography. I had like learned how to master autofocus or something silly like that. And then I realized there's actual technology behind it, but it's really great. I have somebody asking, so a fun story about that great gray owl photo that I shared. When I was photographing that owl, I actually had a very special encounter. Now, this is something that great gray owls are somewhat known for. However, it's by no means common. The owl swooped toward me and landed directly on top of my head. I should have included a photo of that in this presentation, but I didn't. It was heavy. It probably weighed about the same as a cat. To answer your question, Matt. I got Robert asking what software I use for post-processing. That's a good question. I've tried quite a few softwares. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not the most techie mindseted person. So I've found that Photoshop is a little bit more advanced than what I prefer for quick edits. I really like Lightroom. That's where I do almost all of my editing for wildlife photography. I think it's very user-friendly. I haven't found a software that I like better, although I've tested quite a few. All right, let's see. This is an interesting question. How do you compare image quality at micro four thirds that yields greater optical magnification versus an effectively smaller lens focal length magnification with a full frame high resolution sensor that you can crop? To be honest, I haven't done a ton of side-by-side testing. I just prefer that micro four thirds sensor because it enables me to have smaller, more compact gear and not have to wonder, is this going to be an image that I can crop in really closely on in post-production? I can trust that what I see out of my lens is the image itself, and then I can crop further from there, if that makes sense. This is a fabulous question from Dan Knight. How come you're not shooting with the Olympus EM1X? So I think the EM1X is a fantastic camera. Almost everyone that I know prefers it over the EM1 Mark III just because of some of the unique features in there. Personally, as much as I love that camera, I am all about the most lightweight possible option possible when I'm in the field. I'm a relatively small person. I'm not very strong. Anything I can do to reduce the weight of both my pack and my camera setup, I'll do. So I prefer the Olympus EM1 Mark III because it's just that much smaller than the EM1X. Even though the EM1X is a fantastic camera, it's just a little bit big for me. James asked what I was shooting with prior to switching over to Olympus. So I did shoot with a DSLR for the years prior to switching to Olympus. Really, again, I chose Olympus over other cameras, first and foremost, for the lightweight compactness. I really do like to drive home the point that I am all about smallest and most lightweight. The farther I can hike to access wildlife populations, the higher my success rate's going to be. It's not uncommon for me to hike 10 plus miles in a single day with quite a bit of elevation gain in there. Half a pound makes a difference at those amount of miles over, however many days I'll be going out consecutively. Olympus offers such lightweight, high quality gear that it was just kind of a no-brainer for me. So that's what spurred on the switch. And then after switching over to Olympus and finding, okay, this also has really good image stabilization and a few other qualities that I really value, that's what made me stick with Olympus. But what originally inspired me to switch from a DSLR was that weight. You specifically asked what differences would you find between the equipment aside from just weight. Well, like I mentioned, once I started shooting with that gear, I learned that the image stabilization is fantastic, and it enabled me to ditch the tripod, which was huge in weight saving. I really put the weather testing or the weatherproofing to its ultimate tests multiple times, found that it can stand up to basically anything I put it through. Last fall in November, I photographed polar bears in the Arctic. I was shooting in -30 degrees Fahrenheit, and I believe that's also -30 degrees Celsius at that point. I think that's when the conversions are pretty much the same. And my camera gear, despite the ice and wind and snowstorms that we were shooting in, my gear held up perfectly, and so did my battery life. And that was kind of one of those moments where I was like, wow, it's more than just the lightweightness. This gear is as durable as I need it to be. All right, any last minute questions that anyone has thought up? I want to try and address as many as I can. And they don't just have to be photography based. If you have any questions about finding subjects or animals and animal behavior in general, I would love to address those for you today. I'm definitely not an expert in wildlife behavior. I don't think anybody truly is because animals are so unpredictable. But I love to answer what I can of those sorts of questions. Robert just asked, what is the maximum ISO value you'll use / set in your camera? There isn't one. I've got a few photos that I took earlier this month at ISO 6400 that I loved. I did have to do a little bit of denoising in post-production, but I'll push the limits as high as I have to get the shot. I really don't let my ISO be too limiting. Oh, Richard corrected me. -40 degrees Fahrenheit is when it matches with -40 Celsius. That makes sense. This is a good question. Besides camera equipment, what do I use for gloves? And I'm assuming other cold weather gear when I'm out in the field. When it comes to gloves, I lose gloves like it's my job, unfortunately. So I don't really have a preference. I wish I had a better answer to this. I'll wear like a pair of North Face thin lined gloves underneath a pair of mittens and then stuff a million hand warmers in there to keep my hands as warm as possible. When it comes to other gear, I dress in layers because the weather changes so quickly when I'm out in the field that it enables me to respond accordingly. Did I try the 100 to 400 lens? Yep, I did try that right after it first came out. I absolutely loved it. I think it's a fantastic option for somebody who's looking for an alternative to the 300 millimeter prime lens that Olympus offers, or the new big 150 to 400 lens, because it's a little bit more affordable than the new lens. And I know a prime can be a little bit limiting sometimes because obviously you don't have the same zoom capacity. You have to physically move back and forth. Yeah, I really like that lens. I didn't get to shoot with it for more than a few days. I think I had it for maybe a week or two. And I don't own one yet, so I can't go too into detail, but it's a really good option. What backpack do you have found meets your needs for all the long hiking you do? I have yet to find a backpack that I love. I am changing my backpacks constantly because nothing ever fits the way I want it to or is as lightweight as I want to. I'm very picky about that. In the rain, how do you keep raindrops off the lens? So I don't. The lens itself is weatherproof. So no matter how hard it's raining, I've gotten that lens out in weather that's driving rain for hours consecutively, and it's been completely fine because it is weather sealed. When it comes to keeping water off of the actual glass on the lens, there's a lens hood on there which helps kind of protect you from some of the elements. One of the cool features about this new 150 to 400 millimeter lens is that hydrophobic coating that I mentioned when I was kind of summarizing that briefly, that's on the glass at the top of the lens. So what it does is when water droplets actually get onto the glass itself, they disperse, so you don't have all sorts of smudges and stuff from the rain. So that's another thing I love about Olympus is I don't have to think twice when the weather gets bad. Have I tried night wildlife photography? No, not really. I don't use flashes when I'm photographing wildlife. I know that there are some circumstances when flashes are fine, but I am not an expert in when a flash would interfere with an animal's behavior, so I've kind of avoided that altogether. Let's see. Matt asked kind of a follow-up question about what the importance is of not baiting wildlife. Now, I know this kind of does differ depending on the sort of wildlife that we are addressing. Like, birds are definitely quite a bit different when it comes to feeding than, let's say, foxes or bears, but animals become habituated on food rewards. It's important, like I said, when you're photographing wildlife to keep them wild, and not habituating them or getting used to them or getting them used to eating human-provided food just kind of fits along with the ethics. There's a lot of science behind it too, so I recommend doing a little bit of research if you want to learn more, but it's definitely frowned upon because it puts the wildlife at risk. Somebody missed the beginning of the presentation. I don't really do much landscape to answer that question. I almost exclusively do wildlife photography. When I do shoot landscape, actually, I use my telephoto lenses because I'm so used to shooting with them that I'll point them at a distant mountain range and get landscape photos that way. Somebody asked, do I do birds in flight? I do not. It is something I would absolutely love to hone my skills at. I have found it incredibly challenging, and I have so much respect to bird photographers. I don't do a lot of bird photography in general, just because their behavior patterns differ so much from the subjects that I'm used to, that I've been a little bit intimidated to break into that world. I'm going to see if we have any more questions popping on here, but it seems like they're starting to slow down. Let's see if there was anything I missed during the presentation. Somebody mentioned that when they do long hikes in remote areas, they carry a GPS tracker so that their family can keep tabs on where they are and they can alert if there's any danger. I absolutely do carry a GPS tracker. I've actually toyed with the idea of adding that to my gear slide. To anybody who's not super familiar, a GPS tracker is like a satellite phone that connects to satellites. So even when you don't have cell phone service in a remote region, you can still keep in touch with family. Now, it not only makes it, you can send your coordinates to your family so that they can track you as you're moving through an area and make sure that you're, still moving. And if they don't hear from you, they know exactly where you are. It's also really nice in wildlife photography because you can pin coordinates of where you've seen things. So I'm constantly pinning, like if I'm hiking and I find a deer carcass, I'll pin the coordinates of that carcass and know that this is a good spot to return to if I'm hoping to photograph scavengers like coyotes. I will pin eagle nests or owl nests or fox dens if I see them. So I know those are great places to return to in the spring when the babies are either hatching or being born, and set up to photograph animals like that. I definitely recommend GPS trackers in wildlife photography for both of those reasons, both for safety and just to pin the coordinates of interesting indicators that you've found a good spot to photograph wildlife when you're out scouting. So I'm going to give it a few more moments, see if we've got any more last minute questions to come in. And then other than that, I'll send everyone on their way. I appreciate you all taking the time out of your day to join. I encourage you, if you have more questions that you think of after the presentation or just kind of want to discuss wildlife photography in general, feel free to reach out to me on social media. You can be found, or I can be found on Instagram at Brooke Little Bear. That's BROOKE Little Bear, as in like a grizzly bear cub. I'm more than happy to talk all things wildlife photography all the time. All right. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed. I'm going to go ahead and end the presentation here. Again, feel free to reach out if you think of more questions, but I appreciate all of y'all's time.